Hello friends, and welcome back to the Sleepy Scientist Drift. Tonight we're going somewhere unlike anywhere we have ever been before. Not into the bending corridors of space-time, not into the quiet mathematics of a physicist's dream, not into the star-scattered darkness we have drifted through on other soft evenings. No, tonight we're going somewhere far closer and at the same time far stranger than any of those places. Tonight we are going inward, into the deep and ancient story of what we are, where we came from, what we used to be before we were any of the things we now call human. Before language, before fire, before memory, before the first hand reached out and touched the first face and knew that face as kin. Tonight we are going to wander gently through the science of human origins, the remarkable, tender, quietly astonishing story of how life on this planet slowly across enormous stretches of time became us. This is not a story of conquest or achievement. It is not a story of progress in the way that word is usually understood. It is something quieter than that. It is a story of becoming, of a universe that started with nothing but hydrogen and helium and heat, and that after billions of years of patient, unhurried work, produced something capable of lying still in the dark and wondering where it came from. You are that something. And tonight we are going to trace your story all the way back to its beginning. You do not need to hold on to any of this. You do not need to remember it or study it or make sense of it all at once. Just let it drift over you the way the tide moves over a quiet shore. Easy and unhurried and full of something that feels, if you let it, like belonging. If you find your night here at Sleepy Science Drift carrying you gently into rest, and if you would like to leave a comment below, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is as you press play. These quiet conversations help other tired and curious minds find their way here too. But right now, that is the very last thing you need to think about. Right now, all that matters is this: the darkness around you, the breath moving in and out, and the long, gentle story of everything you were before you were you. Let us begin. There is a habit of mind that most of us fall into without noticing. We imagine that the story of humanity begins with human beings, that at some point in the past there were no people, and then there were. A kind of sudden arrival, a beginning with a clean edge, but science tells a different story entirely, a slower story, a story without clean edges at all. The story of humanity does not begin with the first human being. It begins with the first cell, with the first molecule capable of copying itself, with the first faint trembling of chemistry becoming biology somewhere in the warm, dark waters of an ancient ocean more than 3.5 billion years ago. You are not a recent invention. You are the latest chapter of the longest story ever told, and that story has been running unbroken through every creature that has ever lived, every organism that has ever drawn energy from its environment and used it to survive and reproduce. The chain connecting you to that first ancient cell has never once been broken. Not once in 3.5 billion years. Every ancestor in your lineage lived long enough to pass something forward. Every single one. The chain never snapped. And at the end of that chain, impossibly long and impossibly old, is you, lying here in the quiet, breathing slowly, on the verge of sleep. That is not a small thing to carry, but carry it gently tonight. It does not feel like a weight when you let it settle properly. It feels, if anything, like ground beneath your feet, something solid and ancient and deeply reassuring, the way very old things often are when you finally stop to feel them. To understand where humanity came from, we need to begin with the Earth itself, because the Earth is not a backdrop to the story of life. It is a character in it, perhaps the most important character of all. The Earth formed approximately 4.5 billion years ago from a swirling cloud of gas and dust left over from the formation of the Sun. Gravity pulled that cloud together, compressing it, heating it, until a small, rocky world took shape in the inner solar system, orbiting a medium-sized yellow star at a distance that would prove, in the long run, to be remarkable. The early Earth was nothing like the world we live on now. It was a place of extraordinary violence. The surface was molten. Volcanoes erupted constantly across the young crust. Asteroids rained down from the chaos of the forming solar system, some of them enormous. The Moon itself formed from the debris of a collision between the early Earth and a Mars-sized body that struck it roughly 4.5 billion years ago. The impact was so immense that it partially vaporized both worlds, scattering debris into orbit that eventually coalesced into the pale companion we see rising over the horizon on quiet nights. In those early days, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere, no water on the surface in any stable form, no land as we know it. Just heat and rock and the thin, poisonous gases leaking from 1,000 volcanic throats. And yet, within a few 100 million years of the Earth's formation, something had already begun. The oldest evidence of life on Earth dates to approximately 3.5 billion years ago, and some scientists believe life may have appeared even earlier than that. Stromatolites, layered structures built by ancient communities of microorganisms, have been found in rocks in Western Australia that are among the oldest intact geological formations on the planet. These structures look at first glance like unremarkable lumps of stone, but inside them is the trace of something almost impossible. Life already organizing itself, already building communities, already processing sunlight and chemistry into energy and growth 3.5 billion years before the present moment. How life first arose from chemistry is one of the great open questions of science. The origin of life, the step from non-living chemistry to self-replicating molecules, is not yet fully understood. Various hypotheses have been proposed. Life in the sheltered warmth of deep-sea hydrothermal vents, where hot, mineral-rich water provided both energy and raw materials. Life at the edges of tidal pools, where the concentration and evaporation of organic molecules might have produced the first self-replicating structures. Life seeded from space, carried to Earth in the hearts of comets or asteroids, a hypothesis called panspermia. None of these has been conclusively proven. The origin of life remains one of the most beautiful and most humbling mysteries in all of science. But what we do know is this: life appeared. Remarkably early in the Earth's history, given all the violence and chaos of those first hundreds of millions of years, chemistry crossed a threshold and became biology. And from that moment, the universe was different. For most of the history of life on Earth, everything alive was microscopic. This is a fact that can be easy to skim past too quickly, so let us sit with it gently for a moment. For approximately the first 2 billion years of life on Earth, there were no animals, no plants as we understand them, no fungi, no forests, no creatures with eyes or fins or legs or shells, just microorganisms. bacteria and their cousins, the archaea, living in every available environment, from the scalding heat of hydrothermal vents to the surface of ancient rocks. Billions of years of life, and all of it invisible to the naked eye. This is not a period of failure or waiting. This is one of the most creatively productive eras in the history of life on this planet. The microbes of the early Earth invented almost everything that life would later depend on. They invented the chemistry of metabolism, the conversion of raw molecules into usable energy. They invented photosynthesis, the extraordinary trick of capturing sunlight and using it to build complex organic molecules from water and carbon dioxide. And in doing so, they did something that changed the planet completely. The first photosynthetic organisms began releasing oxygen into the atmosphere as a byproduct of their activity. For a long time, that oxygen was absorbed by iron dissolved in the ancient oceans, reacting with the seawater and precipitating out as rust, leaving behind the distinctive banded iron formations that geologists still find in some of the oldest rocks on Earth. But eventually, around 2.5 billion years ago, the capacity of the oceans to absorb that oxygen was exceeded. Oxygen began to accumulate in the atmosphere. This event, which scientists call the Great Oxidation Event, was one of the most significant turning points in the history of life. For many of the microorganisms living at the time, oxygen was toxic. It was a poison flooding the atmosphere, and for a world full of life that had never needed to deal with it, the Great Oxidation Event was something like a catastrophe. The first mass extinction caused not by an asteroid or a volcano, but by the metabolic activity of countless billions of tiny living things, breathing out a gas that would eventually make all complex animal life possible, including yours. In the oxygen you breathe right now, the oxygen moving through your bloodstream as you lie here, the oxygen feeding the quiet work of every cell in your body, it is a gift from microorganisms that lived 2.5 billion years ago. Every breath you take tonight is part of that ancient chain, part of that unbroken story. Somewhere around 2 billion years ago, something happened inside the world of the microbes that would make everything that followed possible. A cell ate another cell or engulfed it in the way that single-celled organisms sometimes do, absorbing other cells as food. But this time, instead of digesting it, the host cell and the engulfed cell began living together, cooperating. The engulfed cell, a type of bacteria capable of using oxygen to generate energy, became what we now call the mitochondrion, the powerhouse of the cell, as every school biology student learns. But it is much more than a powerhouse. It is a symbiont, a partner, an ancient act of cooperation fossilized inside every cell of your body. This merger, which scientists call endosymbiosis, was one of the pivotal events in the history of complex life. The resulting cell, the eukaryote, with its distinct nucleus and its internal compartments, and its mitochondria generating energy from oxygen, was dramatically more capable than anything that had come before. It was the blueprint for all complex life that would follow. Every plant, every animal, every fungus, every organism visible to the naked eye, all of it descended from that ancient partnership between two cells that chose, or perhaps was simply trapped into, cooperation. Inside you right now, in every one of the approximately 37 trillion cells that make up your body, there are hundreds or thousands of mitochondria, each one carrying its own small circle of DNA separate from the DNA in your cell's nucleus. a genetic echo of the ancient bacterium it once was. You are not a single organism in the simple sense. You are a community, a collaboration, an ongoing conversation between descendants of ancient microbial partnerships, working together so seamlessly that you never notice the negotiation, just the breathing, just the warmth, just the quiet hum of being alive. For a long time, the eukaryotes remained single-celled, but then gradually something new began to happen. Individual cells began staying together after dividing instead of drifting apart. They began to specialize, different cells in the same cluster, taking on different roles, some for feeding, some for movement, some eventually for sensing the environment. And multicellular life began. The first multicellular organisms appeared roughly 800 million years ago. They were soft and simple, nothing like the creatures that would eventually evolve from them. But the principle they embodied was revolutionary. A single organism could be made of many cells, each contributing to a collective life that none of them could sustain alone. Around 540 million years ago, in the period that geologists call the Cambrian, something extraordinary happened. Over a relatively short span of geological time, perhaps 20 or 30 million years, the diversity of animal life exploded. New body plans appeared in rapid succession. Eyes appeared, and legs and shells and fins and gills. Predators appeared, and with predators came an evolutionary arms race that would never really stop. The Cambrian explosion, as it is called, produced most of the major body plans that exist in the animal kingdom today. Among the creatures of the Cambrian were some small, soft, jawless, fish-like animals, unremarkable in comparison to the spectacular, armored and spined creatures surrounding them. But these animals carried within them something important. A notochord, a stiffening rod running along the body. The ancestor of the vertebral column, the ancestor of your spine. You are lying on that spine right now, feeling it against whatever is beneath you. That structure, that arrangement of bones and cartilage and connective tissue running the length of your back, is the inheritance of a small, soft creature that lived in a Cambrian sea more than 500 million years ago. It found a way to survive. It left descendants, and those descendants, over hundreds of millions of years, became fish, and then something that crawled from the water onto the land, and then something that walked on four legs through ancient forests, and then eventually something that lies in the dark and wonders where it came from. Let us follow those early vertebrates out of the Cambrian Sea and into the long story of fish, because for a very long time, fish is what our ancestors were, and what extraordinary creatures they were. The fish that gave rise to the lineage leading eventually to us were lobe-finned fish, a group that still has living representatives today in creatures like the coelacanth, a deep-sea fish whose lineage has remained largely unchanged for hundreds of millions of years, and the lungfish, which breathes air as well as water and can survive dry seasons by burrowing into mud and entering a kind of suspended animation. The lobe-finned fish had something their ray-finned cousins did not. Their fins were not simple fans of membrane. They were fleshy, muscular structures supported by bones arranged in a pattern that, with only modest modification, could become a limb, a leg, an arm, a hand. Around 375 million years ago, a creature appeared that paleontologists call Tiktaalik rossi, a name given to it by the indigenous Inuit people of the Canadian Arctic, where its fossil was discovered. Tiktaalik was a fish, but it was a fish unlike any living today. It had a neck, which fish do not have. It had primitive wrist bones. It had ribs capable of supporting its body weight, and its fins had the internal structure of a limb. It could prop itself up on those fin limbs and lift its head from the water to look around. Tiktaalik lived in shallow tropical rivers and swamps in a world of vast delta systems near the equator of a very different Earth. It may not have walked onto land as such, but it could explore the shallows, drag itself across mudflats, lift its body and look. It was on the threshold, a creature living between two worlds, still a fish by most measures, but carrying the blueprint of everything that would one day walk on land. When you reach out your hand tonight to adjust your pillow or pull your blanket closer, the bones moving inside that hand, the wrist, the palm, the 5 fingers, are modified versions of the same arrangement that existed in the fins of Tiktaalik 375 million years ago. The same fundamental structure, recognizable across all that time, adapted for climbing and gripping and writing and gesturing and reaching and holding. The move from water to land was not a single event, and it did not happen quickly. It was a gradual exploration over millions of years by creatures that were becoming more and more capable of surviving in the unfamiliar conditions of the terrestrial world. Gravity was harder to deal with on land without the buoyancy of water. Drying out was a constant threat. The air was loud with new sounds. The light was harsher and more variable, but the land offered things the water could not. Food that nothing else was yet eating. Space uncrowded by competition, and over millions of years, the descendants of those early amphibious creatures began to adapt. Their skin thickened, their eggs changed, developing the amniotic membrane that allowed them to be laid on land without drying out. Their legs strengthened. And what emerged were the amniotes, the lineage from which all reptiles, birds, and mammals would eventually descend. Among the early amniotes were creatures called synapsids, sometimes mistakenly called mammal-like reptiles, though they were neither reptiles in the modern sense, nor yet mammals. They were something in between, something becoming, and for tens of millions of years during the Permian period, they were the dominant, large land animals on Earth. Then came the greatest catastrophe in the history of animal life. The Permian Triassic extinction event, roughly 252 million years ago, likely triggered by an enormous series of volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia that released vast quantities of carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere, triggering a cascade of climate changes, ocean acidification, and ecological collapse. Approximately 90% of all marine species and 70% of all land species went extinct. The world was, for a time, almost empty. It is strange to lie here and consider that 90%, 70%, the world almost emptied of complexity. The long work of hundreds of millions of years of evolution nearly undone in a geological instant. And yet the chain did not break. In the ruins of the Permian world, small groups of survivors held on. Among them were some of the synapsids, small, unassuming animals that had managed somehow to weather the catastrophe. From these survivors, the lineage that would become mammals continued quietly into the devastated world of the early Triassic. The Triassic world was quickly colonized by a different group, the archosaurs, the lineage that would produce the crocodilians and the dinosaurs. And for the next 160 million years, the dinosaurs would dominate the large animal fauna of the land. The synapsids, the proto-mammals, shrank. They became small, they became nocturnal, living in the margins, in the shadows, in the cracks of a world ruled by creatures many times their size. This long nocturnal period, this time of smallness and hiding, may have been one of the most important shaping forces in the history of the mammalian lineage. It is thought to be part of the reason why mammals developed such sophisticated senses. Living in darkness meant that smell and hearing became more important than vision. The parts of the brain devoted to smell expanded. The capacity for processing detailed auditory information grew more sophisticated, and it may be part of the reason why mammals developed warm-bloodedness, the ability to generate and maintain their own body heat, an enormous energetic expense that pays off handsomely when you need to be active in the cold of night. The small, warm, quick-nosed, sharp-eared mammals of the Mesozoic lived in the shadow of giants, and in that shadow they were preparing, without knowing it, to inherit the world. 66 million years ago, an asteroid approximately 10 to 15 kilometers across struck the Earth near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The impact released energy estimated at billions of times that of the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The immediate destruction was catastrophic, but the longer-term consequences were what truly ended the age of the dinosaurs. Dust and debris thrown into the upper atmosphere blocked sunlight across the planet for months or years. Photosynthesis collapsed. The food chains that depended on it collapsed. In the cold and dark that followed, the large dinosaurs, magnificent and dominant as they were, had no path to survival. The small mammals did. Their modest size meant modest energy requirements. Their warm-bloodedness let them stay active in the cold. Their sophisticated chemical senses helped them find food, even in darkness and decay. And their brains, already remarkably complex for their body size, gave them the flexibility to adapt their behavior as the world changed around them. In the aftermath of the extinction, the mammals that survived found themselves on a planet largely emptied of the creatures that had suppressed them for so long. And what followed was one of the most spectacular diversifications in the history of life. Within a few tens of millions of years, mammals had colonized nearly every available ecological niche. There were small insect eaters and large herbivores. There were carnivores and omnivores. There were mammals that returned to the water and became the ancestors of whales and dolphins. There were mammals that took to the air and became bats. There were mammals that climbed into the trees. That last group, the tree-dwelling mammals, is where our story becomes most personal. The primates, the order of mammals to which we belong, emerged roughly 85 to 90 million years ago, though for much of that time they were small and unassuming creatures. After the extinction of the dinosaurs, they diversified rapidly. Their life in the trees had already shaped them in distinctive ways. Tree living favors certain traits: eyes that face forward, allowing stereoscopic vision and accurate depth perception for judging distances when leaping from branch to branch, hands capable of gripping with flexible fingers, and eventually opposable thumbs that can wrap around and hold a branch, a fruit, a tool. A relatively large brain for body size, because navigating a three-dimensional environment of swaying branches requires more sophisticated spatial processing than moving along the ground. reduced reliance on smell. The dense, scent-filled world of the forest floor became less important when you lived in the canopy. And with the reduction in the size of the snout that housed the smell organs came changes in the architecture of the face. The eyes moved forward, the face flattened. Something that would eventually become recognizably human began to take shape. The early primates split into various lineages over tens of millions of years. Some became the prosimians, the bush babies and lemurs and lorises that still exist today. Others became the ancestors of the monkeys of Africa and Asia, and separately, the monkeys of the Americas. And from the old world primate stock, roughly 30 to 25 million years ago, emerged a lineage without tails, the apes. The apes were, from the beginning, characterized by larger brains and more complex social behavior than their monkey cousins. They were slower-lived, taking longer to reach maturity, investing more in each individual offspring. They were curious and flexible in their behavior, capable of solving novel problems in ways that relied on understanding rather than instinct alone. Among the ancient apes, two lineages diverged that are of particular importance to us. One became the ancestors of the gorillas. Another, sometime between 6 and 7 million years ago, split into two branches. One of those branches led to the chimpanzees and bonobos, the other to us. 6 or 7 million years ago. It is worth sitting with that number for a moment. It sounds large, and it is in human terms, but in geological time it is almost nothing. It is roughly 150 thousandths of the age of the Earth. Our split from the lineage of chimpanzees happened so recently, by evolutionary standards, that we still share approximately 98.5% of our DNA with chimpanzees. The differences between us are real and important, but they are differences built on an enormous foundation of sameness, a sameness that runs all the way back through the apes, through the early primates, through the first mammals, shivering in the dark of the Mesozoic, through the fish and the single cells and the ancient oceans. We are not apart from the tree of life. We are the most recent twigs on one of its branches, still connected, still continuous with everything that came before. The period after our split from the chimpanzee lineage is sometimes called the hominin period, the phase of our evolutionary history when the lineage leading to modern humans was slowly accumulating the traits that would distinguish us. And this was not a simple, straight-line progression from ape to human. It was messy and branching and full of dead ends, the way all of evolution always is. Many different hominin species existed across Africa and eventually across Eurasia over the past several million years. Some of them walked on two legs but had brains not much larger than chimpanzees. Some of them made stone tools but left behind almost no other signs of complex behavior. Some of them spread across the world and thrived for hundreds of thousands of years before vanishing. The story of our lineage is not a story of inevitable progress toward us. It is a story of experimentation, of many different answers to the question of how to be a large-brained, ground-dwelling primate in a world of changing climates and shifting environments. Among the earliest well-known hominins was a group called Australopithecus, which lived in Africa from roughly 4 million to just under 2 million years ago. The word means southern ape, though they were far more human than that name might suggest in some ways, and far more ape-like in others. In 1974, a team of paleoanthropologists working in the Afar region of Ethiopia made one of the most famous fossil discoveries in the history of science. They unearthed the partial skeleton of a small female Australopithecus who had lived approximately 3.2 million years ago. They named her Lucy after the Beatles' song Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which was playing in their camp the night of the discovery. Lucy was small. She stood approximately a meter and a quarter tall. She had a brain roughly a third the size of a modern human brain. Her face was projecting and ape-like. Her arms were long in proportion to her body. She would have looked, to a casual observer, far more like an ape than like a human being. But Lucy walked upright. Her pelvis and the angle of her femur bones made clear that she moved habitually on two legs. She was a biped in a world of quadrupeds. She walked through a landscape of African woodland and grassland that was being slowly and inexorably reshaped by climate change, the forests shrinking, the open savannas expanding. Why bipedalism evolved is a question that paleoanthropologists have debated extensively. It is energetically efficient for covering long distances on the ground. It frees the hands for carrying food or infants or tools. It raises the head, improving visibility across open grassland. Probably several of these advantages reinforced one another. Whatever the initial trigger, bipedalism became the defining physical characteristic of the hominin lineage. Everything else that followed was built on that first step onto 2 feet. The brain is where so much of our becoming is written. And the story of the enlarging hominin brain is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of life on Earth. The brain is extraordinarily expensive to run. It consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy budget, despite making up only about 2% of body weight. Building a bigger brain meant finding more food, developing more efficient ways of processing that food, and making trade-offs in other areas. The hominin lineage found ways to pay those costs. The discovery of fire and cooking, which made food more digestible and increased the energy available from each meal, is thought by many researchers to have played a significant role in fueling the expansion of the brain. The development of stone tools, which allowed access to the rich nutrients in meat and marrow, may have helped too. But the brain did not simply enlarge in a uniform way. Particular regions expanded dramatically. The prefrontal cortex, associated with planning, decision-making, and social cognition, expanded enormously in the hominin lineage relative to other primates. The regions associated with language, Broca's area and Wernicke's area, expanded and became more specialized. The capacity for what cognitive scientists call theory of mind, the ability to model the mental states of other individuals, to understand that others have beliefs and desires and intentions that may differ from your own, became more sophisticated. These changes in the brain were not just physical changes, they were changes in the nature of experience. An animal without theory of mind experiences the world very differently from an animal with it. An animal without complex language inhabits a different cognitive world from an animal that can speak. As the hominin brain changed, the inner world of the creature changed with it. Consciousness, whatever it is, deepened and became richer. The capacity for self-reflection emerged. The ability to imagine the future grew more sophisticated. The experience of time changed, and with it perhaps the first inklings of wondering, of asking, of the kind of quiet, resting curiosity that brings you here to a channel called sleepy scientist drift and lets you listen, on the edge of sleep, to the long story of what you are. The genus Homo, the group to which modern humans belong, first appeared roughly 2 to 2.5 million years ago in Africa. The earliest members of our genus were still quite different from modern humans, but they were already making stone tools, crafting the simple flaked implements known as the Oldowan tool industry, which appeared approximately 2.6 million years ago. These were not just rocks, they were intentional modifications of one material using another, a behavior that requires planning, knowledge of how different stones behave under pressure, and the fine motor control that comes with a modified hand and a sophisticated brain. Homo erectus appeared around 1.9 million years ago and was, in many ways, a remarkable creature. It was the first hominin to leave Africa, spreading across Asia and Europe in one of the great dispersals in the history of our lineage. It mastered fire. It made the more sophisticated Herculean tools, elegant teardrop-shaped hand axes that were created following a mental template, a held image of what the finished tool should look like before the napping began. It may have lived in social groups with enough internal organization to care for injured or elderly individuals, as evidenced by fossils showing individuals who survived serious injuries that would have required sustained help to recover from. Homo erectus was not us, but it was no longer simply an ape either. It occupied a middle space, walking fully upright through landscapes across 3 continents, tending fire, shaping stone, living in communities, perhaps communicating in ways more complex than any animal had managed before. For most of the history of the genus Homo, multiple species coexisted and sometimes overlapped. Neanderthals, who lived across Europe and Western Asia from roughly 400,000 to around 40,000 years ago, were not primitive brutes as they were once portrayed. They buried their dead, they created ornaments, they made pigments, they cared for injured companions, they interbred with early modern humans, a fact written in the genomes of everyone alive today, whose ancestry traces to populations outside of sub-Saharan Africa. If you are of European, Asian or Australasian descent, roughly 1 to 4% of your DNA came from Neanderthals. They are not entirely gone, they live on, in a quiet way, inside you. There were also the Denisovans, known primarily from tiny fragments of bone and extraordinary ancient DNA recovered from a cave in Siberia. The Denisovans were widespread across Asia and may have interbred with the ancestors of modern humans in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, emerged in Africa approximately 300,000 years ago. The earliest fossils that clearly belong to our species come from a site in Morocco called Jebel Irhoud, where remains were found in 2017 that were dated to approximately 315,000 years old. These early modern humans already had faces quite like ours, though their brain cases were still somewhat elongated compared to the rounder shape typical of later modern humans. But anatomical modernity, having the body of a modern human, came before behavioral modernity, doing the things that modern humans do by quite a long time. The explosion of symbolic behavior, art, complex ornamentation, long-distance trade in rare materials, the confident making of complex composite tools, these things seem to emerge more fully around 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, and their emergence may have coincided with changes in the social structure and the complexity of language that left no direct fossil record. Around 60 to 70,000 years ago, a group of modern humans left Africa and began moving into the wider world. They crossed into Arabia and then dispersed east along coastal routes into South and Southeast Asia and eventually Australia, and north and west into Europe and Central Asia. These were not explorers in any self-conscious sense. They were people following food, following water, following the paths opened by familiar landscapes and the logic of daily survival. But in aggregate, their movements constituted one of the most extraordinary dispersals in the history of life. Within roughly 20,000 years of leaving Africa, modern humans had reached Australia, a feat that required crossing significant stretches of open ocean. By around 45,000 years ago, they were in Europe, where they encountered and eventually replaced the Neanderthals. By around 15,000 years ago, or possibly earlier, they had crossed into the Americas via a land bridge or coastal routes that existed during the peak of the last ice age, when sea levels were much lower. Within a few thousand more years, they were at the southern tip of South America. One species, starting from a single continent, colonizing the entire planet in geological terms almost instantaneously. It is, when you consider it properly, something that had never happened before in the history of multicellular life. And along the way, these ancient modern humans were leaving behind something that no other animal has ever left behind in anything like the same way. They were leaving behind stories. The cave paintings of Lascaux in France, created approximately 17,000 years ago, show horses and bulls and deer moving across underground limestone walls with a vitality and accuracy that still astonishes artists who see them today. The people who made these images did not do so carelessly. They chose their locations with care, using the natural contours of the rock to give their animals dimension and life. They worked by firelight, deep in the underground dark, in chambers that required crawling through narrow passages to reach. The Chauvet Cave in France holds paintings thought to be approximately 37,000 years old, among the oldest known, and a cave in Sulawesi, Indonesia, holds paintings of animals, and a hand stencil estimated at least 45,000 years old, pushing the known origins of representational art back further than many had imagined. What were these images for? Scholars have debated the question for generations without reaching consensus. Ritual, storytelling, records of hunts, attempts to influence the world through representation. No one can say with certainty. But something in the question almost answers itself. The impulse to make an image of something, to capture it, to say this existed, this was real, this is what I saw. It is a profoundly human impulse. It is the same impulse that takes photographs and writes journals and makes films. The impulse to leave a trace, to reach through time and say, I was here. And reaching through time is exactly what those ancient artists did. They pressed their hands against a cave wall and blew ochre pigment over them, leaving a negative print of a living hand in the rock. And 45,000 years later, visitors stand in those caves and look at those hands and feel something shift inside them. A recognition, a connection across an abyss of time that should be unbridgeable, but somehow is not. That is what language and story and image do. They build bridges across time. They are the reason you can lie here tonight and listen to the story of creatures who lived millions of years before you and feel, in some quiet way, that it is your story too. There is a concept in evolutionary biology called deep homology, the idea that traits in very different animals, traits that appear quite different on the surface, are in fact built using the same underlying genetic toolkit. The eyes of an octopus and the eyes of a human being evolved independently in separate lineages and are different in many of their details. But both are built using a gene called PAX6, the same gene, doing the same fundamental job in creatures that diverged from a common ancestor 500 million years ago. This principle of deep homology runs through nearly everything you are. The basic organization of your body plan, head at one end and tail at the other, with a gut running through the middle, this is ancient beyond imagining, conserved across the enormous diversity of animal life. The genes that tell your limbs where to grow and which direction they should point, the Hox genes, are versions of the same genes that told the limbs of the first-limbed animals where to go hundreds of millions of years ago. The genes that control the development of your heart are related to the genes that control the development of the heart in flies. You are not just connected to other humans through your genetics, you are connected to all of life. The deeper you look into the molecular biology of living things, the more the separations between species become gradations rather than gaps. You share more than a third of your genes with a yeast cell. You share the fundamental machinery of cell division with every living thing on Earth, from bacteria to sequoia trees to blue whales. The genetic alphabet is the same. The code in which the instructions are written is the same. The mechanism by which the instructions are read and carried out is the same. Life on Earth is not a collection of independent inventions. It is a single project, built and rebuilt and modified over billions of years, always working from the same foundation, always carrying forward what came before. And you are the most recent elaboration of that project, not the culmination, not the end point, just the most recent expression of something that started in the warm, dark waters of an ancient ocean and has been becoming ever since. Let us slow down now. Let us drift from the deep science into something softer, something that is more about feeling than about knowing. Think about what it means that you are here, not just in the abstract philosophical sense, but in the literal biological sense. Every ancestor in your lineage, going back 3.5 billion years, every single one survived long enough to reproduce. Not one of them in an unbroken chain stretching back to the origin of life itself failed to pass something forward. They survived droughts and ice ages and mass extinctions. They survived predators and disease and the slow grind of geological time. They crossed oceans and mountains and continents. They lived their small lives, whatever those lives were, and they passed the thread forward, and the thread came to you here, tonight, in this bed, in this room, in this moment of quiet, at the end of a long day, on the edge of sleep. There is a kind of rest in that thought if you let it settle. You did not arrive here alone. You arrived here with 3.5 billion years of survivors behind you, with the accumulated resourcefulness of every creature in your lineage, with the warmth of your mammalian heritage, the curiosity of your primate ancestry, the language and story-making of your human nature. All of that is in you. All of that is you in some deep and fundamental sense. You have always been becoming. From the first cell to Lucy walking upright across a warm African plain, to the first person who pressed a hand against a cave wall and left their mark in ochre, to every human being who has ever lain in the dark and felt the strange pull of wonder the strange ache of existing, the strange comfort of not being alone in time. You are part of that sequence. You carry it forward just by being here. There is a phenomenon in neuroscience sometimes called the default mode network. It is a collection of brain regions that become most active not when you are focused on a task, but when your mind is at rest, when you are daydreaming, when you are thinking about yourself or other people, when you are doing exactly what you are doing right now, lying quietly, letting the mind wander where it will. The default mode network is associated with what researchers call self-referential processing, the brain's way of thinking about itself, about its own history, about its own future, about its place in the world. It is also associated with creativity, with the kind of loose, associative thinking that connects ideas across distant domains. And it is associated with the experience of narrative, the brain's tendency to organize its experience into story. Storytelling, it turns out, is not a luxury added on top of the basic human experience. It is fundamental to how the human brain organizes reality. We do not experience our lives as a sequence of disconnected events. We experience them as stories with continuity, with meaning, with characters and causes and consequences. The narrative self, the self that knows it has a past and imagines it has a future, is something that seems to emerge from the activity of those resting, wandering brain networks. This means that when your mind is most at rest, it is not empty. It is telling you stories, weaving the threads of experience into something coherent, something with shape. And those stories, those self-narratives, are one of the things that make you most distinctly human. No other animal, as far as we can tell, constructs its experience into a narrative the way you do. No other animal reflects on where it came from and where it is going, places itself consciously within a larger story. No other animal listens to a story about its own deep origins and feels, in response, something like recognition, something like coming home. The night sky has been with us for all of our long becoming. Our hominin ancestors looked up at the same stars, the same moon, the same band of the Milky Way. The ancient light raining down from those stars fell on Lucy walking through her woodland, on Homo erectus tending fire, on Neanderthals burying their dead, on the people who painted horses on cave walls by torchlight. Long before we had names for the stars, long before we had mathematics or calendars or telescopes, we looked up. It seems to be something deep in us, this turning of the face toward the night sky. An ancient behavior perhaps encoded in the long evolutionary history of creatures that used the stars for navigation, for orientation, for marking the seasons. Many early human cultures organized their year around the movements of specific stars and constellations. The heliacal rising of Sirius, the moment when Sirius first becomes visible on the eastern horizon just before sunrise, marked the beginning of the annual flooding of the Nile for the ancient Egyptians and served as a kind of celestial clock governing the rhythm of agriculture and society. The Pleiades, a small, tight cluster of stars in the constellation Taurus, were watched by cultures from Europe to Australia to the Americas for their role in marking agricultural and ceremonial seasons. The stars connected people to time, to the rhythm of the year, to something larger than the span of a single human life, and in doing so they were already doing something that science has since formalized. They were placing individual human existence within a larger context, reminding a person standing in the dark with their face turned upward that the world is old and wide and full of patterns that long predate any single human life and will long outlast it. That reminder is not a diminishment, it is, if anything, a kind of relief. To be small in the presence of something vast and old is not frightening when you also understand that you are part of it, that the hydrogen in your body was forged in the first minutes after the Big Bang, that the heavier elements, the carbon and nitrogen and oxygen and iron, were made in the cores of stars that lived and died before the Earth existed, that you are, in the most literal and chemically accurate sense, made of stardust. The physicist and author Carl Sagan said something that has stayed with many people who heard it. We are a way for the cosmos to know itself. A universe that began as nothing but expanding gas found a way, after billions of years of patient, unguided becoming, to arrange itself into beings capable of looking back at the universe and wondering about it. You are the universe wondering. You are the cosmos turned briefly back on itself in curiosity and amazement. That is what you are, among other things, among all the warmth and weariness and worry and love and hunger and hope that make up a human life. That is also what you are. There is one last thought to drift through before sleep. Among all the things that make humans distinctive, one of the most remarkable is not a physical trait. It is not our upright posture or our dexterous hands or even our large brains. Extraordinary as all of those are, it is something harder to point to and easier to feel. It is care. The capacity for genuine other-directed care, for tending to individuals who are not your own offspring, for maintaining bonds of affection and loyalty across time, for feeling something like grief at the loss of another, for sitting with a person who is in pain and simply being present, not for any strategic reason, not because of any calculation of benefit, but simply because they are there and they are suffering and you are there and you are not. That capacity did not appear from nowhere. It was built over millions of years. It is in the fossil record, in the bones of a Homo heidelbergensis individual found in Spain who had survived for years with a severe cranial deformity that would have required sustained care from others to live through. It is in the evidence of Neanderthal burials, in the care taken to place the dead with deliberateness and perhaps with meaning. It is in every early human infant who was carried through hardship by parents whose love preceded any word for love by millions of years. The warmth of connection, the comfort of presence, the particular peace of lying safely in the dark while knowing that other warm bodies exist nearby, this is not a human invention. It is a mammalian inheritance. It goes back to those small, warm-blooded creatures in the dark of the Mesozoic, whose extended parental care and complex social bonds were already laying the groundwork for everything that would later become family and friendship and community. And it goes back further than that, to the deep social structures of primates, to the grooming and the hierarchy and the alliances, to the trust built slowly over time between individuals who live close together, to the slow, patient construction of something that functions like society, like mutual recognition, like the understanding that the other beings around you matter. You carry all of that with you every time you feel warmth towards someone you love, every time you feel relief at returning somewhere familiar, every time you feel the specific comfort of not being alone in the dark. You are expressing something ancient, something that was being built long before language existed to name it. The care that keeps you here tonight, whatever form it takes, whoever it includes, wherever it lives in your life, that is evolution's gift, built across millions of years of creatures who found that warmth and connection made survival more possible, until warmth and connection became not just a strategy, but a need, not just a behavior, but a feeling, not just a feeling, but something so fundamental to what we are that a life without it does not quite feel like a life at all. And now, dear listener, the long, gentle story of before we were human draws slowly toward its close. We have traveled far tonight, from the first trembling of chemistry into biology in an ancient ocean, through the vast Precambrian world of the microbes, through the explosion of animal life in the Cambrian seas, through the first tentative steps of lobe-finned fish exploring the edge of the terrestrial world. We have walked with Tiktaalik in the shallows and with Lucy across the African woodland. We have sat around the first fires of Homo erectus and stood in the flickering torchlight of the cave at Chauvet. We have traced the slow expansion of the hominin brain and the emergence of language and story and art. We have considered the deep homology connecting you to every living thing on this planet. We have looked at the stars the way your ancestors looked at them, feeling the ancient pull of something vast and unhurried and quietly magnificent. And through all of it, one thing has remained constant: the thread, the unbroken chain of becoming that runs from the first living molecule to the person lying here right now, breathing slowly, feeling the weight of the day dissolving, moving softly toward rest. You are not separate from that story. You are not an observer of it. You are its most recent sentence. The universe is still writing, still becoming, and you are part of what it is becoming. Right now, time is doing what it always does so faithfully. It is passing, gently and without drama, the way it has always passed, the way it passed for Lucy in her woodland, and for the Cambrian creatures in their sea, and for the first cell in its ancient ocean. One moment at a time, each moment making way for the next, and you are moving through those moments towards sleep, toward the deep, restorative dark, where the brain does its quiet maintenance work, where memories are consolidated and the body is repaired and the mind is readied for another day of being conscious and alive and capable of wondering. Let your body grow heavy now. Let the thinking that has been moving through your mind tonight grow slow and loose and formless. Let the ideas drift apart the way clouds drift apart, leaving the sky open and clear beneath them. You have been here for all of it, in a sense. Every moment of the long story we wandered through tonight is a moment that led through an unbroken chain of survival and reproduction and becoming to you. You are its heir, its continuation, its living expression. You do not need to do anything with that right now. You do not need to feel any particular way about it. You can simply let it settle in the way that true things settle quietly, without fanfare, finding their level in the deep and resting part of the mind where wonder lives. Breathe in, breathe out, feel the support of whatever is beneath you: the blanket, the pillow, the mattress, the floor, the earth below the floor, the ancient rock below the earth, the deep, slow layers of a planet that has been turning for 4.5 billion years and is turning still, carrying you through the dark toward morning. You are safe. You are held. You are part of something so old and so large that it has no name in any language, and yet it is the most familiar thing there is, because it is what you are made of. It is what you are. Sleep now. Let the long story continue without your attention for a while. It will still be there in the morning. And so will you, rested and renewed, ready for another day of the extraordinary, improbable, ancient, beautiful fact of being alive. Good night.